Hello everybody, I am Educator Emily and welcome back to part 2 of our evolution and phylogenies series. So last week we talked all about what is evolution, what does it mean, we talked about some examples of it, we talked about domestication and how that's evolution, and last week I told you guys that this video was going to be focusing on how scientists chart that, or how do scientists show this process through time. And they show this process through time using phylogeny and phylogenetic trees, which is what we are going to be doing in today's lesson. I'll be walking you guys through what the heck a phylogenetic tree is and how to read and to create one. So first things first, let's define phylogeny. So a phylogeny is a visual representation of the evolutionary history of populations, species, or genes. And this is done with a phylogenetic tree. And a phylogenetic tree is just a diagram that represents the relationships between these organisms and these species over time. Now, these trees are constantly changing as scientists learn more from paleontological data, right, from dinosaurs and things that we dig up in the ground, as well as from genetic data. So the farther that science advances, the more that these trees continue to change and the more we begin to learn about everything on Earth's evolutionary history. So if these things are constantly changing, why do we even use them? Well, despite the fact that they do change fairly frequently, they can be extremely helpful. These diagrams allow scientists to kind of hypothesize and visualize evolutionary processes over time. The pattern of branching in these trees, which we will talk about later, shows how species and groups diverged and evolved to become what we see today, or the fossil record. Some other definitions that you might hear me talk about throughout this video are homologous characteristics, analogous characteristics, and the principle of parsimony, in addition to everything that we're going to define on the tree. Let's start with the definition for homologous characteristics. Homologous characteristics are characteristics that you see in two or more species that are very similar because they have been inherited from some common ancestor. One of these classic examples of homologous characteristics is the bones in the human forearm and the bones in the flippers of dolphins and the wings of bats and the flippers of seals. We have all of the same bones in the same structural alignment because we are all mammals. We all shared a common mammalian ancestor that had these forearm bones, and that trait persisted across multiple mammalian lineages. Analogous characteristics are similar but different. So these are characteristics that have arose in two or more species as a result of convergent evolution and not shared ancestry. These have merely come about because of similar ecological needs. So think, bees' wings and birds' wings. Bees are insects and birds are birds, which are technically reptiles. They aren't related in any way, shape, or form closely at all. However, they both fly. They both locomote primarily through the air. So wings have evolved in both of these groups despite them not being related. This is an example of convergent evolution and an analogous characteristic. Lastly, let's define the principle of parsimony before we start to delve into the structure of a tree. And the principle of parsimony is a really crucial rule when you're making these trees. To put it simply, and to personify evolution is lazy. It's going to take the easiest path forward, which means that when you are looking at these trees and creating these trees and you want to apply the principle of parsimony, things are going to behave in the simplest way possible. Meaning, if you have the option to branch into 4 different directions in a tree versus 2 different directions in a tree, the most likely option is probably the one where you only branch twice, as opposed to 4 times. So the principle of parsimony just states that things are going to behave in the simplest fashion. Okay, so right here I have an example of what a simple phylogenetic tree might look like. And now, using this tree, we're going to define a couple of terms. The first one being a branch. So a branch represents a lineage throughout time, and these branches connect successive speciation events or other branching or diverging events. And the branches in this tree are the black lines. So they are this right here, this here, this here, this here. Your trees, what you're drawing, are primarily made up of branches. Now, the nodes are places in a phylogeny where you have a divergence or an evolutionary split. These represent ancestral populations or species, and on your phylogenetic trees, they're going to be represented by the big black dots with the orange arrows pointing at them. So this here, this is a node or a split. That's a node or a split. That's a node or a split. And that's a node or a split. Now, the tips of your tree are going to be at the very end, and they represent the terminal ends or the species, population, genes, individuals, organisms that you are talking about. So in this tree, that would be things like primates and cats, birds, reptiles, frogs, and fish. Those are all the tips of our trees. That's where we're ending. The last definition we're talking about is clades, and those represent single branches within a phylogenetic tree or the tree of life. And there are 3 types of clades. The first clade is called a monophyletic clade, and this is known as a true clade. The monophyletic clade in this tree here is represented by the primates and the cats, or this little pink bracket here. They share one common ancestor, it's one branching event here, they're one monophyletic clade. We also have polyphyletic clades, which is basically a group of organisms that does not include the common ancestor of all the organisms in that group. So the polyphyletic clade in this example is represented by blue, the birds and the cats. So it shares this common ancestor in the clade, this node, right back here, but it does not include the common ancestor of primates and cats, or the common ancestor of birds and reptiles. So it leaves out those common ancestors. That's a polyphyletic clade. The third type of clade is a paraphyletic clade. And this is a group of organisms that share a common ancestor, although the group does not include all descendants of that common ancestor. So here in this tree, our paraphyletic clade is represented by this green line here, right? So it includes reptiles, birds, and cats, which all share a common ancestor all the way back here at this node. Got that common ancestor in there as well. It's got that common ancestor in there as well. Okay, cool, we're looking pretty solid. However, it includes one organism in this group of animals, but not the other. So it excludes primates while including cats, and thus is excluding completely this node here. That's a paraphyletic clade. So now I'm going to walk you through how to create that tree that you just saw in the last part of the module where we were defining nodes, tips, clades, etc., etc. So the way that I like to do this is basically to start by making a table of all of the animals that you know you're charting in your tree. So here that's your fish, your frogs, your reptiles, your birds, your cats, and your primates, and the traits that you are looking at. So I picked a total of 4 traits that we're going to be looking at throughout evolutionary history in our tree. Now, those traits are whether or not that animal has a spine, whether or not that animal has legs, whether or not that animal is an amniote, and whether or not that animal produces milk and has hair. So those are the 4 traits that we're going to be looking at in our tree. Now, when I have this table out in front of me, what I like to do is I like to go organism by organism, trait by trait. If the organism that I'm looking at has that trait, I mark the box with a 1. If it lacks that trait, I mark that box with a 0. So 0s are no's, 1s are yeses. I'll use those 1s and 0s then to determine where I will have branches or nodes throughout my phylogenetic tree. So I've actually just decided to color code each of these traits just to make it easier to follow when we're actually making the trees. So spine is red, legs are orange, amniote or internal egg is green, and hair and milk is going to be blue when we chart our actual tree. So let's start with our first organism, which is the fish. Now, are fish vertebrates? Do fish have a spine? Yes, they do. Okay, awesome. So we're going to take our red marker and we're going to put a 1 in the fish box. Now, what about frogs? They also have a spine, so we'll put a 1 in that box. Reptiles also have a spine, as do birds, cats, and primates. We are all vertebrates, we all have a spinal column. So all of these organisms will get a 1 in that first box. Okay, let's move on to our next trait, which is orange for legs. Now, here's where things are going to start to change, because fish don't have legs. So for this box, they will get a 0. However, every single organism after the fish does have legs. As a result of this, every single other organism, frogs, reptiles, birds, cats, and humans, will get a 1, because they all have legs. Alright, so let's move on to our next trait, which is whether or not our organism is an amniote, or has internal eggs. So, let's start with our fish. So our fish, they have a spine, they do not have any legs. Fish also are not amniotes, they lay their eggs outside of their body, so they will get a 0 for this category. Now, let's move on to frogs. Frogs are amphibians, and one of the characteristics of amphibians is having jelly-like eggs laid outside the body. They will also get a 0. So not only are amniotic eggs adapted to live inside the mother, amniotic eggs are also adapted for a life on land. An amniotic egg is characterized by having a layer known as the amnion. And this was an adaptation that arose in animals that became land-based. So animals like your fish and your frogs that are still primarily reproducing in water, they don't need this amnion. This amnion kind of acts as a protective layer for your land-based animals, your reptiles, your birds, your cats, and your primates. Cats and primates just happen to take it one step further and kept the whole process inside the body. So amniotic eggs are characterized by having a specialized structure in the egg. Every other animal is terrestrial: reptiles, birds, cats, primates. We all live on land, so they will all get a 1. Now, the last trait that we're going to be talking about is whether or not this animal has hair and produces milk. Now, these are traits very unique to one specific group of animals, and that is our mammals. Now, the only mammals in this group of organisms are going to be our cats and our humans, which means our frogs, our fish, our reptiles, and our birds will all get a 0 for this category. Alright, so now we have a table telling us where our branching occurs in our tree. All we have to do is follow the zeros. So, we should have a branch when organisms start to show that they have legs. We'll also have a branch when animals become amniotic. We'll also have another branch when animals start to produce hair. So now let's make that tree. Alright, now it's time to make our tree. And if you can see down in the corner, I made a little color coding diagram so that I remember which color is which as we go through this. So, the trait that all of our animals shared was the fact that they had a spine. So that is going to be the first trait that we chart in our tree. And that color was red. So, let's start by making our first line. Awesome, we've drawn our first line, but we can't just label this fish, because we're going to have to branch somewhere else here for every other organism we have in our tree, right? So instead, what we'll do is we'll make fish its own branch, branching off of this. So it's going to look somewhat like this. And this is where fish will sit in our tree. Now, for this group of organisms, fish are what we call the outgroup, meaning that they really only share a couple of the basal characteristics with all the other animals in our tree. Typically, that's only like the first 1 or 2, and then everything else gets more complex from there on out. So fish are known as our outgroup, and they're just going to hang out there for the rest of the time. But now we have to deal with every single other organism that we had. So our next branching event happened when animals in the fossil record started to show legs. So our frogs, our reptiles, our birds, our humans or primates, and cats. So let's start to draw that part of the tree. But we can't make it all red, so I'll do this. Draw a little bit there, and then at our branching event, where we start to see legs, I'm going to make a line in black. Alright, so this is where we see legs start to show up, and legs we coded as orange. So, What organism did this branching off event first occur on? Well, it was our frogs. So the frogs are going to be the next branch that we draw. So now your tree is going to look like this. All of our other organisms also had legs though, so you can start to continue your tree downwards. But there were other traits that popped up that other animals share that frogs do not, so we have to start charting those. So again, I'll make a mark in black where that split occurs. This next split is occurring with the amnion in the egg. And we're using green for our amnions. So now let's draw those animals. Those were our reptiles, our birds, our cats, and primates. Okay, now what? Reptiles and birds can't just sit on one line. They're separate groups. So why don't we wait? We'll come back to them in a little bit. Now let's try charting our cats and our primates. So let's keep on going down. These guys had a special trait. They have hair and they produce milk, which we decided was going to be blue. So let's start that color line. Okay, so now we've run into the same problem with these guys that we've ran into with our reptiles and our birds. We can't just put cats/primates here because they're totally separate groups. We can't put reptiles/birds here because although birds are descended from reptiles, they are not reptiles. They are their own group. They're birds. So what do? Well, you create another node and you show more branches. So like I just said, birds and reptiles are related. Birds diverged from reptiles, which means they share a common ancestor. So we can make a node here and two individual branches branching out, showing the reptile group and the bird group separate. And same thing with our primates and our cats. They are both mammals, which means at some point they shared a common mammalian ancestor before the cat group and the primate group diverged into the groups they are today. So we can do a very similar thing here that we did with the reptiles and the birds. And now you have it. You have your tree. Now, I forgot I didn't put spine in there as our first shared trait among them all, so I add that in right now. So, let's walk through this tree together. We start here in the very beginning. This trait is the presence of a spine. Does the animal have a backbone? All of these animals within this tree have a backbone. Sweet. So now we start to show them on this tree. This second trait here, this is the presence of legs. Fish lack legs. They also lack amnions in their eggs, and they lack hair and milk. They are outgroup, so they're going to hang out at the very top of our tree here. However, frogs, reptiles, birds, cats, and primates, they all have legs, and they are all found after this branching event, this common ancestor. Our next trait was the presence of an amnion in the egg. Now, the only animals that have this in our group are reptiles, birds, cats, and primates. So the animals down there past the presence of this trait. Our frogs and our fish, they lack an amnion. Their evolutionary ancestors did not have it, and nor do their modern ones. Thus, we find them before this divergence on the tree. Last but not least, we have the production of milk and hair, which is a trait unique to only mammals. Now, the only mammals on this tree are our cats and our primates right here. So, this common ancestor produced milk and had hair and gave rise to the groups that are cats and primates today. This common ancestor had an amnion, which gave rise to a mammalian group and a reptilian and bird group. reptiles and birds then further diverged in their evolutionary history. Common ancestor of frogs had a spine and legs. However, it lacked an amnion and hair and milk. You get the frogs we see today. And fish lacked all of these three traits. However, they do have a spine, and they went on their own evolutionary path. And there you have it. You have your tree. Now, this tree example is taken from Zimmer and Emlin's Evolution, Making Sense of Life, the second edition, published in 2016. All right, so congratulations, you guys have created a tree. Now that we've done that, let's talk about some common misunderstandings of these trees. Now, one of these common misconceptions is that trees can tell you when these traits emerged, and that is not the case. All the trees can tell you is that trait A evolved before trait B. For example, amnions in eggs evolved before hair and milk production in mammals. Doesn't tell us that, amnions evolved, 3 million years ago, whereas hair and eggs are only 1 million years old. I actually don't know how old those traits are, but the trees don't tell us that. They just tell us that amnions evolved before hair and milk production. Because of this, it just tells scientists the relative order in which these evolutionary changes occurred. Another common misconception of these trees is that once an organism splits, like our fish, that it stops evolving, that it's somehow a lower organism than the organisms farther down in the tree, like cats and primates. And this is not the case. The split from all other animals in a tree just means that that organism and that group no longer shares any of the characteristics further on in that tree. That group kept evolving to make them the group of animals they are today. Fish are highly evolved for their environments. Primates are highly evolved for their environments. But you couldn't take a primate, put it in the ocean, and expect it to be nearly as successful as a fish, and vice versa. So fish, just because they branched off first and earlier and they don't share any of the other characteristics in our tree, does not mean that they're less evolved. Another misconception is that the way a tree looks right now, at the very tip, at that terminal end where we had our fish, our frogs, our lizards, etc., a lot of people think that that's just kind of where it stops. Evolution is a constant process. The animals that we talked about at the tips of the trees, they are still evolving. Millions of years from now, they might look completely different. So the evolution that we talked about today does not just end today. And lastly, there is no strict order in which you must create your tree. We put fish at the top, but you also could have put fish at the bottom. We could have swapped reptiles and birds so that birds were on top and reptiles were not. All that matters is that you have the evolutionary relationships correct. So, for example, I couldn't make birds my outgroup because, they still had the amnion and the legs and the spine. So the tree would not have made much sense if I put birds in the space where the fish were. However, you can organize your tree however which way you want, as long as the evolutionary relationships make sense. That concludes part 2 of our evolution and phylogeny series. I hope you guys learned something and were able to understand this. I understand that tree creating is a very difficult topic, let alone a difficult topic to learn virtually. I appreciate you guys watching. Make sure to tune in next week. All across social media in May, ZooMontana has been talking about animal adaptations. If you follow us on Twitter, one of those adaptations that we have been talking about is animal intelligence. And next week, our video is going to focus all on the history of animal behavior and studying animal intelligence and some really cool examples that scientists have learned that have changed how we view evolution of intelligence and cognition as a whole. So please tune in for that next week. Until then, have a wonderful rest of your week. Bye, everybody.